So I would say growing up, Final Fantasy was easily my favorite gaming franchise. Me and my friends, we were completely obsessed with the games. I remember, and this is as sad as it sounds, I remember making those cheesy AMV videos back in the 2000s. You know, the ones that would have like a gameplay of Final Fantasy playing with some Linkin Park in the background. Yeah, that was completely me, and to be fair, they did quite well. So this year, I finally got around to actually replaying my very first game in the franchise, which of course was Final Fantasy X. How I got into Final Fantasy was through another little known Squaresoft title called Kingdom Hearts, all the way back in 2003, which I'm going to cover someday. I promise it'll be on the channel. Unfortunately, Bobby will probably hate hearing that. But there I'd seen the likes of Tidus and Waka, and obviously seeing them in Kingdom Hearts just kind of made me interested and wanting to pick up Final Fantasy X. And I'm glad it did, because Final Fantasy X, it's an epic, unreal, fantastic game. And replaying it this year, it was extremely nostalgic for me. So in this video, I wanted to touch on my thoughts with the game and ask myself, does Final Fantasy X still hold up in 2023? So the first task was finding out just where to actually play the game. Now, I have it on PlayStation, I have it on Switch, and I also got it on PC. I just gotten it on Steam Deck and decided to play it there, mainly because, look, I had access to the speed boosts on the PC versions, and they aren't available on the consoles. I'd like to touch on this quickly, but the Final Fantasy games now typically have cheats enabled quite easily. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, personally, I play these games for the story. Obviously, back as a child, I've spent my time grinding. I'm not against it. Obviously, as an adult, you don't maybe have the same amount of hours in a day, but I can definitely see the case made that they do taint the games a bit. So what is Final Fantasy X about? What is the story? Well, Final Fantasy X follows the story of Tidus. Tidus is a young blitzball player. Think water polo meets soccer, transported into the future during an attack of a huge Godzilla-like creature called Sin. So 1,000 years seemingly pass, and Tidus wakes up in a world called Spira. He meets a girl called Yuna, who is a summoner, whose basically mission is to take on and defeat Sin. They're not alone, so Tidus meets a group of, I think, really interesting characters actually. So they all set out with Yuna to put an end to Sin. So every 10 years, Sin comes back and causes death and havoc on the world of Spira. Throughout the game though, we start learning a bit more about what's going on, why is he there, and we uncover dark secrets about the world itself, and it's all very interesting and very well done. So that's it in a nutshell, but like all Final Fantasy games, there's a ton of depth and the story's enough to have you hooked. So you'll typically be wondering what's next, just looking to get the next story beat. Replaying the story, I understood a lot more this time around than when I first played at 10 years old. I don't think I grasped the whole religion and faith undertones, even though it is pretty much in your face throughout. So the game itself, it explores the influence of religion and the blind faith that the people of Spira have for the teachings of Yevon, I believe it's called. So you do see, you know, the fact that people have these extreme religious beliefs start to get questioned throughout the game, which adds a lot more depth, especially to certain characters that are in the party. And it definitely is quite a unique thing to have in a game, especially a Final Fantasy game. It's all pretty heavy shit, but pair that up with some good old sacrifice, which I'll not spoil here, and commitment to fulfilling a destiny that potentially can kill you, and you've got a pretty solid story. Final Fantasy also nails the cast of characters. Everyone's so different, both in personality and playstyle. At the forefront, we have Tidus. Now, Tidus, as I mentioned earlier, is a famous blitzball player who's coping with being transported 1,000 years into the future. Very early on, we hear about Jack. Jack is Tidus's dad, who was pretty much the best blitzball player known to man. He was a Messi of Spira, put it that way. 10 years prior to Tidus meeting Sin, his dad went missing. Now, during the game, we found out Jack didn't actually go missing. He was at Spira at the time, 1,000 years in the future. And throughout the game, you start to see Tidus grow as a character. He starts to learn more about his father, obviously what happened 10 years prior, and it just adds to the game and gives you a much better, well-developed character going forward. And he starts connecting to the group, especially Yuna, and starts changing completely. Yuna is a central character in Final Fantasy X. Yuna is the summoner. A summoner's role is basically to defeat Sin, like I said earlier. So she has to go on a journey or a pilgrimage to defeat sin, and her character development's great because her father, 10 years prior, defeated sin and gave us what was called the Calm, which is basically 10 years before sin returns to then wreak havoc, and it's a never-ending cycle. So it just shows you her kind of struggling with the weight of the responsibility, and her character arc is fantastic. It's mainly about just discovering herself, and it's a deeply compelling gameplay narrative, and it's fantastically interwoven with Titus's and everyone else's. So the rest of the cast, they're all great. So you have Waka. Waka is a Blitzball player turned guardian who's taking care of Yuna on the pilgrimage. He's paired up with Lulu. Lulu is a black mage who, at the start, she doesn't have much of a personality, but over time she kind of lets loose, as you would say, I guess, and grows a bit more of a personality. You have Kamari. Think Bigfoot-esque, but he's called what's a Ronso, and he's always protected Yuna from a young age. You have Orin, who was a guardian of Yuna's dad when he was a summoner 10 years prior. And finally, you have Riku, a girl who is hated by most because of her religious beliefs, differentiating than most of the people in Spira. But she helps out the team and throws some unreal bombs. I think Final Fantasy X, it has the best combat in a turn-based game. You can take your time with it, and on the top right, it'll actually show you, there are outlines who's next to attack, and depending on what spell or attack you do, it can delay attacks and let you plan your offense better. There's a good mix-up in terms of what way to approach different enemies. So for example, Titus is quite fast and nimble, so he's better for fast-paced enemies in terms of being able to attack them before they can dodge. Waka throws a blitzball, so he's better for enemies that are flying. And then obviously you've got the likes of Orin, uses heavy attacks, so he can break kind of heavy defensive enemies who are a bit more shielded. So you end up kind of knowing what enemy to use with what player in your party, and the player switching here is easy. As soon as it's your turn to go, you can press a button and swap a character out. So it's a lot more nimble and fluid than previous Final Fantasy games in terms of using the whole cast of characters rather than, oh, this person's way under leveled, I don't use them. So you do end up using a lot more characters a lot more of the time. And if anyone remembers, there was actually a Lord of the Rings game called The Third Age back on the PS2. That game actually took the Final Fantasy X combat and mimicked it completely. If anyone played that, oh, it was a solid game. But no, that game there, if you are a fan of Final Fantasy X combat and Lord of the Rings, that is a game that you must play because it is fantastic. Leveling up, you use something called the Sphere Grid. Basically, you progress in a linear progression, unlocking different abilities or HP throughout. I wasn't against it at all, but it's not exactly mind-blowing. I know some people love the Sphere Grid, but to me personally, I could take it or leave it. I'm personally just happy with basic Final Fantasy VII-esque leveling, to be fair, but obviously that uses the materia system, which I do enjoy. So I could take it or leave it. Some people really do, like I said, love the Sphere Grid. The gameplay overall still holds up very well. I enjoy the downtime and just pattering around, talking to characters around the world. Seems much more immersive than we get with the newer Final Fantasy games. Obviously it's a very linear game comparing to the older Final Fantasy style of like 7, 8 and 9. You do kind of just push forward at all times. You do stop and rest in certain areas. I don't mind it too much. It's a nice tight-knit gameplay narrative. Personally, I think the whole go anywhere, do anything approach in the games, I'm not a big fan. Obviously Final Fantasy 16 is somewhat more linear, but I prefer that approach rather than, 15's approach of a whole open world design. So the game is extremely narrative heavy. I think there's 11 hours of cutscenes in the game alone, and I don't mind that. I actually don't. I don't mind a good narrative heavy game. The only thing I did have an issue with was the combat can be a real slog. There's so much of it. Constant battles. As a kid, obviously I don't mind that because you have all this time in the world, but getting through the game without the speed boost these days would require a good bit of patience and effort from myself. So that's what I mean. I was glad it was there because it did make it a lot more easy to get through. I did actually like the gameplay loop as well. So obviously the gameplay loop in this Final Fantasy X is a good bit of story content. You can maybe talk in an area with a lot of people, get a good understanding of the world, get a cutscene, progress to a next area. In that next area there might be a lot of battles, but then you go to the next area and you're going through the temples that Yuna goes to get a summon. Now in these temples there's a mixture of gameplay, a bit more puzzling, and I think back in the day I would have had a hard time getting through it. This time it was fine, and I enjoy kind of the difference it brings to the gameplay, because that was something that wasn't in any other fantasy game as far as I can remember. The gameplay always kind of pushes forward. It doesn't seem to get too stale for too long. That's what I like with this game. It always kind of leaves you wanting to know what's next. So I can imagine playing this as a first fantasy game even now and becoming really into it and getting really enthralled with the story and the gameplay. A Final Fantasy game wouldn't be complete if it wasn't for the fantastic soundtrack. This time around, I think Final Fantasy X has perhaps my top 3 gaming soundtracks of all time with music, created by series composer Nobuo Uematsu. The opening intro soundtrack to Sonarkand is one of the best piano pieces of all time. Have a listen. Final Fantasy X was a critical and commercial success, and was the first in the franchise to spawn a direct sequel in Final Fantasy X Part 2. Unfortunately for me, this was the last Final Fantasy game I properly enjoyed, and after this, I feel the series went downhill and just never returned. I never enjoyed any Final Fantasy game after this. Replaying Final Fantasy X was a joy. It's a time capsule of memories from my childhood, and one that I can always go back and play at any time. If you've never played Final Fantasy X, trust me, play the game. And if you have played the game, share your memories in the comments below. And if you have liked the video, like and subscribe. And thanks for listening, guys.